Hello, and welcome to Stuart Saturday Live with me, your hostess, Andrea Zuvich, the 17th century lady. My guest today will be historian and professor Adrian Tinniswood, and we'll be talking about the Great Fire of London, 1666. He'll be with us in a few minutes. Well, we woke up to quite a foggy day here in northern Derbyshire, England, and we usually have a pretty clear view of the Stuart-era Bolsover Castle from our house, but today, not at all. It's quite eerie, but it's perfect for gearing up for cooler nights as autumn fast approaches. I'd like to thank everyone who attended my talk on Barbara Villas at 1620's house in Donnington-le-Heath, near Colville, Leicestershire, last Saturday. This gorgeous historic property is rich with 17th century history, including the Digby family, who were connected with the gunpowder plotter Sir Everard Digby. Now, 1620's house used to be called Donnington-le-Heath Manor House and was originally built in the late 1200s, so it was pretty old by the 17th century. And you can see this is the main house. My talk took place in the barn, which is adjacent to this building, and it was so lovely. The staff and the audience were just delightful. Among those who visited was my fellow historian and friend, Susan Margaret Cooper, who surprised me with a visit, and these lovely flowers that have been on my desk ever since. Thanks, Sue. Many of you have probably already known Sue for a while. She is the author of several history works, including her most recent book, Actresses of the Restoration Period. So definitely something for those of you who love the Stuart era. Well, today's guest is a highly acclaimed, best-selling author of not only Stuart history, but of histories of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. Of his many works, he has written The Great Fire of London, The Essential Guide. Joining us live from County Mayo, Ireland, please welcome Professor Adrian Tinniswood.
Thank you very much, Andrea. What a lovely introduction. It's great to be with you. Great to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. I know that you've been it's a source of inspiration for me. If you like to see, for example, I'm a bit of a fan. These are just...
what a star you are.
These are just the ones that I have as paperbacks. I have ebooks too. So, and I did that thing. I think I told you about it. That, you know, that thing that some of us do where we buy two kinds of the same book.
I know.
So I bought the hardback.
Better and better.
Yeah, so I bought the hardback and the paperback. So it's such a delight to have you on the show. So this week, of course, is the 358th anniversary of the Great Fire of London. And yeah, now almost everyone has heard about this event, even if they're not particularly into history. But to set the scene, Charles II had been restored to the throne 6 years before, in 1660. It was now the 2nd of September, 1666, and London had experienced a hot and very dry summer. The previous year, there had been a very serious and fatal outbreak of plague, and the royal court had moved to Oxford, where it was considered a safe distance away from the dreaded contagion. Now, some Londoners were disgruntled by this, disgruntled with the king for this. But with the Great Fire, would you please give us a summary of what occurred and when, please?
Delighted. Now, what I want to do, though, is to take you back to the 1st of September, Saturday, the 1st of September, because what everybody forgets with the Great Fire of London, two things. They forget about the war and they forget about the wind. And these two things are crucial because on the afternoon of Saturday, the 1st of September, everybody was talking about the war with the Dutch. We've been at war with the Dutch for 2 years? We just had it was going quite well Robert Holmes and a contingent of Marines had just a couple of weeks earlier had landed at Westerschelling in the Netherlands and set fire to 150 ships and burned the town. And this afternoon, Saturday, the 1st of September, this afternoon, the English battle fleet, commanded by General Monk and Prince Rupert, were bearing down on the Dutch. And it was going to be the battle to end all battles. This was going to be the decisive one. This was going to show the Dutch what it was all about.
Mhm.
Only as the two fleets engaged in the Channel, a huge storm blew up, a gale blew up, and it was impossible for them to fight. Sails were blown out, masts were blown over, ships crashed into each other, and both those fleets retreated to their respective ports. But the gale didn't retreat. The gale crossed the Channel that afternoon. It
Mhm.
moved up through Kent in southeast England. It toppled chimneys, it blew off thatch, and round about midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, the 2nd of September, the gale hit London. And it
Wow.
just so happens that at that very minute, at that very moment, a baker in Pudding Lane forgot to put his oven out. If it
Ah,
hadn't been for that gale, there'd be no fire of London. And
incredible.
that gale, it's amazing. That gale blew for 3.5 days, and it fanned the flames the whole time. If it weren't for that, London would have been safe.
Wow. And that's something that is not mentioned usually in
No,
in
no, I know.
these histories. That's really interesting. So, for the children that have asked why it started, there you go. Really interesting. Well, and you mentioned the baker, and that was, Thomas Fariner, am I correct? Yeah.
Indeed, yeah, yeah.
Okay, and he was the owner of the bake shop and was, largely considered responsible, and he said that it wasn't his fault. Um,
Yeah.
so what are your thoughts about that? Do you think that he was truthful or that it was just a freak accident, or was he a bit negligent in some way?
What I think, Andrea, is if I'd actually accidentally burned down the second largest city in Christendom, I'd be trying to say it wasn't my fault as well. No,
Makes sense, yeah.
it's yeah. It looks as though the ovens weren't properly damped down. What
Mm,
what happened was Thomas Fariner and his daughter Hannah were
mhm.
woken at about 2 o'clock ish that morning by a manservant who said that he smelled smoke. They tried to go
Oh,
downstairs because the bake shop was in the basement, basically the ground floor, and they
mhm.
couldn't. There was smoke pouring up. So they clambered out onto a window ledge and climbed into their neighbour's bedchamber, which, let's face it, must have shocked the neighbour a little bit. It must have
Sure,
come as a little
yes.
bit of a surprise. There was
Yeah.
a maidservant. There is a story, at least, that there was a maidservant who was frightened of heights, and she wouldn't step out on the window ledge, and she was overcome by smoke and she died, and she is the first casualty of the Great Fire of London.
Oh, I
But
see, yeah.
they clambered down, they raised
Mhm,
the alarm, and there were fires all. What we forget is there are fires all the time in English
mhm.
towns and cities and villages. We're looking at a world lit by fire, if you think about it.
Yeah.
People aired their clothes in front of open fires. They looked for chamber pots with a lighted candle under the bed and did stupid stuff like, I mean, I still not the chamber pot, but I still do stupid stuff like that. And fires broke out, and there was a
Yes.
there was a kind of fixed routine. You threw all your belongings out into the street. You raised the parish constables. They shut off either end of the street to stop people kind of gawping and crowds appearing. They rang the church bells in the parish, the muffled peal, to alert everybody, and everybody just came along. Most churches had great fire hooks, 18, 19-foot long poles with hooks on the end that they used to pull down burning thatch and even to pull down timber frame buildings, because there are a lot less sturdy buildings in the 1660s than there would be today. And it was a
Hmm.
normal thing to do. But this time that wind was blowing. So they did all of that. But the wind had blown embers from the Pudding Lane fire into the neighbouring street, Fish Street, and they
Right.
landed in the stable yard of an inn. Star Inn on Fish Street, and they landed on the straw, and they set fire to the straw, and then the wind blew the straw up into the air. So you've got burning embers flying all over the place, and very
Mm,
quickly that fire's moving along the Thames, very quickly indeed.
of
They
course.
by early morning, by later that morning, they decided it was so serious that they had to call in the Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth. They wanted permission to pull down more houses in Pudding Lane.
Mm.
Thomas Bloodworth was not a great leader. He was inept. He was ineffectual. Bless him. He'd had a rough time. He's the one who he became Lord Mayor in the middle of the plague the year before. Instead of having a great
Really?
procession and everything, they saw him in at a barber shop round the back of the Tower of London. It wasn't the kind of party he'd expected. And this time he was just too panicky. He said, I can't give you permission to pull down these buildings because we can't get hold of the owners, and we need to ask the owners permission to pull them down. So he went back to
Oh,
bed. He went back to bed, and London burned down because of it.
oh dear. And I suppose it's an apocryphal story about him. He's claimed to have said something. There is a
Yeah, you
line.
say it. You say it. I chickened out. Do you want me to say it?
Yes, please.
He, he said when the parish constables pressed him and said, "Look, this is getting out of hand. It's getting serious." He took one look and said, "A woman could piss that out," and he went off to bed. And a place in the history books, of course. That's
Yes.
all he's remembered for.
Wow, that's quite a line. Yes, but it shows how he was so careless about the whole thing.
I
But
don't
you
think
did
he
mention
realised how serious it was, Andrew.
no,
I think the thing is he just didn't. He didn't engage with it. He didn't realise how bad things were.
no. But as you did say earlier, fires were a regular sort of
Yeah.
thing in Stuart Britain because of the proximity to uh, flammable objects all the time with candles and fires and all that. And later, I think it was late William III's reign,
Mhm.
Whitehall Palace, because of I think it was a maid who was hanging the clothes too close to the fireplace, and that just created chaos. Oh wow, and very interesting. Now, in 1654, over in Delft in the Dutch Republic, or what we
Mhm.
now know as the Netherlands, they had a very serious and fatal disaster, often referred to as the Delft thunderclap. This happened because a gunpowder store blew up, causing a massive explosion. And I
Wow.
believe over 100 people died and thousands were injured. Had the Great Fire of London reached the Tower of London, which also contained large stores of gunpowder, I believe, there would possibly have been an even greater amount of destruction, or at least a similar situation to that which had occurred in Delft nearly a decade before. Uh, do you think that's safe to
Yeah,
say?
I think that is safe to say. What saved the tower is that this wind was blowing from east to west. So
Mhm.
the fire started relatively close to the Tower of London. I mean, Pudding Lane's not very far away. It's only kind of a few
No.
hundred meters maybe,
Mhm.
but the wind was blowing it away from the tower. So what did happen though, the I think on the Tuesday or the Wednesday when things were really bad and the fire started to creep eastward as well. It started to creep towards the tower and those magazines,
Mm.
that store
Mhm.
of gunpowder.
Right.
Or engineers from the tower started to blow up houses between the fire and the tower. Now, as far as I know, I'm sure somebody can correct me. As far as I know, this is the earliest instance, certainly in Western Europe, of gunpowder being used as a fire as a fire prevention measure. It's the first instance I've ever seen of
Hmm.
streets being deliberately blown up to form a fire break, so the fire couldn't cross. What that did
Right.
do, of course, it scared everybody witless because the one thing that I think we've alluded to, but one thing that everybody thought, Robert Holmes had just set fire to Vesta Schelling. We were at war with the
Mm.
Dutch. This is a
Yes.
terrorist attack. This is
Yeah.
obviously a terrorist attack. It's the Dutch or it's the French who are their allies. But clearly this isn't an accident. And once they started to hear explosions going off by the tower, they were convinced that a Dutch army was invading.
Hmm. Right. Well, that leads me to our next section, which is some people believed that uh, others had started the blaze, including one Frenchman who came to a terrible end. In your book, The Great Fire of London, you wrote that, well, it's by permission of heaven, the story of the Great Fire of London.
That's close enough. Close enough, Andrea.
You wrote that one William Taswell saw a mob looting the shop of a French painter. Do you remember this incident? And if so, could you
Yeah.
please tell us more about him and what happened?
It actually happened because people thought that the fire was started by terrorists. They started to identify anybody who looked foreign by their language
Right.
or sounded foreign, and to beat
Mhm.
them up in the street. I mean, James, Duke of York, who I should say was a hero in the fire, an absolute hero. James, Duke of York, future James II, he had the political acumen of a chicken. He was useless as a king, I think. You can disagree with me, but I thought he was useless as a king. He was so brave, this man. He was incredible. I mean, this is the guy who had been Lord Admiral of the Fleet
Mhm.
and who had been standing on the deck uh, uh, of his ship with his comrades when a Dutch round of chain shot hit them all and
Yeah.
basically blew all his friends up. I mean, his
Yes.
James' only wound was on his forearm, and that was from a skull fragment from his best friend. I mean, it was, and he just
Yes.
went straight back out to sea. I mean, it was only when Charles,
Yeah.
as you know, Andrew, only when Charles II forbade him from putting himself at risk. So he was a very
Mhm.
brave man, and he spent the
Yeah.
Monday. He spent the Monday actually with a group of lifeguards saving foreigners who were being, they were trying to lynch them on street corners. They were beating them up. They were. William Taswell remembered this Frenchman being knocked to the ground by a blacksmith with an iron bar, and remembered years
Mm.
later how the blood from his head poured down into the gutter. The mob
Wow.
was frightened. It was just really
Mm.
frightened.
Right. Um, and so, yes, you mentioned that there were these rumors and fears that the foreigners had caused the fire, and that many were under the impression that it was the Dutch who were responsible. And of course, that is unsurprising given the political context of the time with the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and most recently, the English had attacked, as you said, attacked the Dutch in late August, only a few weeks before the Great Fire, with I think Holmes's bonfire.
That's it.
So
Yeah.
some kind of retaliatory action makes sense. So it's not shocking that some people would have thought this. Were there other rumors about swirling about as to the cause of the fire, or was that
Well, I
mainly
mean,
the?
it's mainly what was interesting, I think, was that although the focus to begin with was on the Dutch, it then moves to the French, who
Mhm.
were allies with the Dutch, but who weren't really involved in the war at all. And then, as so often happens with mobs, it was anybody who was foreign.
Mhm.
The Swedish ambassadors, some of their aides were beaten up in the street because they were foreign. They weren't English. They weren't Londoners. Therefore, they were a threat.
Right.
Lady Anne Hobart, writing to her nephew Rafe Verney, she was in Chancery Lane, I think, and she wrote this heartrending letter. Oh, pity us, pity us. The fire is getting closer, something like that. She said, "'Tis the Dutch, 'tis the Dutch fire." And there
Mm.
was this notion that Dutch and French, and of course Catholic, because once it had moved from Dutch to French, then it was a
Mm.
short step from French to Catholic. It was a Catholic
Right.
plot.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
there were Catholics firebombing. They were throwing fire grenades into shop windows and into houses. I mean, none of this was true. None of it was
Mhm.
true at all. But this frenzy swept through the city. It was just, it was just madness.
Mhm. Right. Well, thank you for that. Um, we have had a few questions sent in from some of our audience.
Mm.
The first one
Bring them
is,
on.
Why was the fire not noticed and controlled quicker when it started?
Well, I think
Mm.
partly we've answered that in that it was
Yeah.
noticed and they did try to control it. And again, this
Mm.
gale, this easterly, east to west gale,
Yes.
is what confounded all effort. I mean, James Duke of York on, I think, the Monday or the Tuesday, when things were at their worst on the Tuesday, was coordinating firefighting down by the Fleet on Fleet Street with
Mhm.
a group of courtiers. They were working really hard. I mean, James had his shirt off. He's there with buckets. He's really kind of Charles II adopted a slightly less hands-on approach. He rode around on horseback with saddlebags full of coins, kind of throwing them out to encourage the others. James didn't encourage the others. He if he came across people who he wanted to help fight the fire, and they didn't, he used
Mhm.
to beat them until they did. He found that changed their minds rather more effectively. But
Wow.
James, to go back to your point, James was at one point he's trying to hold the fire at the Fleet, which is before it comes down, down into starts coming towards Whitehall, and the fire leapt over his team of firefighters until he was almost surrounded. There was no way of controlling the fire. And this is another reason why people thought it was a terrorist attack, because fires broke out here and there and there. It was as if people were
Mhm.
starting them deliberately. Well, it wasn't. It was
Right.
it was it was embers being thrown up by the wind. But it just
Mm.
confirmed people's fears,
I
that
see.
this was a human act, an act of aggression.
Mhm. Right. And the second question is, was any government aid forthcoming in rebuilding for folks? Well, maybe we could get to that later, perhaps.
Yeah, I think
Hmm.
we should. Yeah, we
Yeah.
should hold on that.
Yeah. We'll hold on that one. And then, was anyone held accountable in a legal sense? Maybe we should talk about that a
Yes.
bit later too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, let's try to go back to that one in a bit. Um, in our next image, let's see, we have Wenceslas Holler's St. Paul's Cathedral burning in the Great Fire of London, and the scroll above has the words "Etiam perire ruinae," or if my Latin is correct, that means he or the church also perished in the fall. This was made in 1666. St. Paul's was by this time already in a dilapidated condition, having been used as stables, I believe, for parliamentarian soldiers during the interregnum, and was now being used to store a great quantity of books and pamphlets, all of course made of paper. Uh, Now, correct me if I'm mistaken here, but once the fire reached this building, it lit up like kindling. Excuse me. Two of the other nearby churches, St. Faith under St. Paul's and St. Gregory by St. Paul's, were also destroyed in this terrible fire. Uh, there are a remarkable number of churches that have caught fire in recent years throughout Europe and abroad. Would you say it's fair to compare the sense of loss and horror that was felt when Old St. Paul's was destroyed with, say, the fire of Notre Dame in Paris recently?
I think emotionally, it
Emotionally.
certainly was.
Mm-hmm.
It was a symbol. It was a symbol of, God was on our side, and it was London's cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very and what we sometimes don't realise by the the built-up topography of London these days. It was actually on a hill. It was quite
Mm-hmm.
high up, so it could be seen, or even though it had lost its spire in a lightning strike, 100 years before or more, it, it was really visible. I mean, you can tell how visible it was. William Taswell, a schoolboy at Westminster School, on the Tuesday night, he watched from way down the Thames, Lambeth almost. He watched as the flames crept around St Paul's Cathedral. The reason, as you say, there was all this paper in St Faith's in the crypt, was that the stationers of Gloucester Row thought this was the safe place. No, but nothing could harm St Paul's. This was the
Mm-hmm.
safe place to leave all their paper, all their unbound books and pamphlets. The
Right.
thing was that, again, as you say, Andrea, that St Paul's was in a kind of quite a ropey state. In fact, only 5 days before, on the 27th of August, there had been a meeting to discuss what to do with St Paul's, what repairs were needed. Christopher Wren was at that meeting,
Oh,
along
right.
with John Evelyn and Sir Roger Pratt, the one of the an influential court architect, and William Sancroft, the Dean of St Paul's. It was, they all tried to decide what they were going to do to hold it up, if you like. And then that night, the flames crept around St Paul's, but also the scaffolding on the roof, because they're trying to repair the roof. And that scaffolding, those scaffolding poles, started to burn. And as they burned, they fell through the roof, they fell down into the nave, and they fell straight through the nave into the crypt. And the whole thing went up like a bomb. It
Wow.
was, it was an astonishing sight. That the I think, was it Taswell or Thomas Vincent? There was a Methodist preacher who was there, who left a very detailed account as well. One of them said that the lead ran down Ludgate Hill like snow before the sun. This molten lead, these streams of bright red molten lead, and it was an enormous blow to London, I think, to think that their
Yes.
cathedral could just be destroyed like that.
Yeah, and we could see how violent this was in the images that we've seen throughout. So it would have been an incredible and terrifying sight. And I think we do have to consider as well that that people in Stuart Britain were more religious than those in 21st century Britain, at least in terms
Just a little.
of Christianity. At least in terms of Christianity. Yeah. Some at the time did opine that the fire itself, as well as the plague before it, were punishments from God. For example, John Evelyn wrote about previous disasters that so exceedingly was God's hand against this ungrateful and vicious nation and court. I mean, he wouldn't have been alone in this mindset.
Oh, no.
And so anything, a major terrific storm or lightning that burns things would be considered acts of God. And I think that's quite important to remember when we talk about these cataclysmic events in the past.
I tell you, if I may, I think that the interesting thing about that, and you're so right, but the interesting thing about that is that those who didn't approve of Charles II's court, like John Evelyn, it was quite prissy, John Evelyn. I mean, I like him, but he was quite prim.
Yeah.
He was quite
Well, he
prim.
didn't like the social
the goings
scene.
on. He didn't like the goings on. Let's say
the cultural zeitgeist was not for him. Yeah.
But I mean, exactly, couldn't put it better. He so there are people like him who see the fire as an act of God, vengeance on the licentiousness of the court. Then there are those who see it as an act of God, it's vengeance against those who killed the king. Back in what is it, 17 years before? My mathematics is terrible. 1649.
Yeah.
40. 17 years. Got it. So they see it as God punishing us for killing a king. Then there are those who still support the good old cause, and there were plenty of them who say this was God's vengeance for restoring the monarchy when we had a republic.
Right.
So basically, you took your pick, which it was God, but whose side he was on was a different matter.
Yeah, indeed, that's true. Wow.
And if you mentioned the importance of religion, I think also we need to remember that religion was part of community. So I mean, look, there were 86 churches in the city of London and the outskirts that were destroyed in the fire, and that wasn't all of them. There was a church on every street corner, and they were part, they were community centres. They were just they were part of what made a neighbourhood. And people went not only because they were religious and they were by and large Anglican, not all of them by a long way, but also because it's what you did. It's where you met people.
Yes, it was very, very much integral to the whole social cohesion in a way.
Absolutely right.
Yes, and on the 7th, which is today, on this day, in 1666, and I'll just read it out of my book, if I may.
Mm.
John Evelyn, on the 7th of September, walked from Whitehall to London Bridge, passing through Fleet Street, Ludgate Hill, Cheapside, the Royal Exchange, Bishopsgate, Aldersgate, Moorfields, and onward. He proceeded with extraordinary difficulty, clambering over heaps of yet smoking rubbish, and frequently mistaking where I was, the ground under my feet so hot that it even burnt the soles of my shoes. St. Paul's lead roof and ironwork and bells had completely melted due to the extremely high temperature of the fire. The fire, not the fryer. um, Evelyn recorded a scene of total disarray and destruction. And he said, the people who now walked about the ruins appeared like men in some dismal desert, or rather in some great city laid waste by a cruel enemy. And so we can get a very clear image of what it was looking like a couple of days after, a few days after the fire had stopped. And he goes on to say that the air was foul as well. So there would have been quite a nasty smell of everything. And he talked about burnt belongings and the stench of human bodies and all sorts of debris. So I find that these writings, these observations from the people who witnessed the Great Fire are extraordinary, because we can learn so much about what they saw and experienced. And this is looking, this is the River Thames here, and Southwark, Southwark Cathedral would have been here in the foreground, and it was looking across, and that would have been where the old St. Paul's Cathedral was, and all of that.
You can see London Bridge on the right, on the extreme right of the picture. There's just a hint
Yes.
of London Bridge. You got it?
Yes.
And the fire started just off picture, just to the right of that.
Yeah. Now this image is quite wide. It's very wide, so we had to just choose a little chunk. But there are so many amazing etchings from the time and drawings.
Andrea, I should say one of my favourites, in fact, a couple of my favourites, are the Dutch, who, although we were at war with them, they were always on the lookout for commercial opportunity. So they had produced etchings or engravings of the City of London. What they did was add flames to them and then start selling them.
Oh wow, that's quite entrepreneurial.
In England as well as it, and then they also offered to sell us timber and bricks and things to rebuild the city, even though we're still at war with them. You know, they're not averse to turning a quick buck, let's say.
I didn't know about that. That's great. Funny. Yeah, so we spoke about the heroic firefighting attempts made by James, Duke of York, and his brother Charles II, and here's an image of both of them together. And considering they weren't very popular at this point, especially Charles II, with many Londoners, because they had left London during the plague, and some Londoners felt alienated and even betrayed by this. Do you think they deserved, or perhaps I probably am being overly cynical here, but were their efforts exaggerated to improve their PR? I mean, in terms of Charles II's, perhaps, maybe. I mean, his brother did do a lot, but you know.
That's an interesting question, actually. I mean, I think Charles's kind of hesitation to help didn't do him any favors at all. But we have to come back for a moment to Thomas Bloodworth, bless him, our poor mayor who's gone to bed. He got up finally. Pepys found him running around saying, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" He was just useless.
Oh no, that's terrible.
But Pepys came back into the city. Samuel Pepys, I should say, he woke up on the Sunday morning, and his maid told him that there were fires burning all the way down he lived in the east of the city. There were fires burning all the way down to London Bridge. And he was really worried because he got people coming around for Sunday dinner. and he thought it was going to interrupt things. As
Oh
indeed,
dear.
no, it didn't actually. They went ahead with it. What the meal must have been like. It must have been a little bit fraught, I think. But
Yeah, I'd
Pepys
imagine
then,
so.
I know, just kind of sitting there, just looking over your shoulder. But Pepys then got in a boat and sailed down to Whitehall and went to see the king and said, "Look, this is getting out of hand. What can we do?" And the king offered to send in lifeguards, send in soldiers to help with the firefighting. This is
Mm.
before James, Duke of York, got his act together. And Pepys went back to Bludworth and said, "Look, I've got this offer from the king. He's offered you soldiers." And Bludworth said, "We don't need them. We don't need them." Now, the subtext to that, of course, is that, 6 years earlier, Monk and his army had marched into the city of London at the Restoration, and
Yeah.
London was still very sensitive about interference from the court. London was independent. It didn't need the king. It had always been quite Republican anyway. So there is a kind of, there's a reason, there's an ideological reason for the reluctance to allow the troops in. But of course, again, it was a massively wrong decision. And poor old Thomas Bludworth got it wrong again.
Wow.
Bless him.
Not really cut out for the job at all.
I know, he was not. He was not.
No.
And then if I remember right, he then married his daughter to Judge Jeffreys, the dreadful Judge Jeffreys who
Yes.
supervised all the hangings after, as you know better than I, of James,
Yeah.
Duke of Monmouth.
Duke of Monmouth, yes.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Wow. That's one thing to another there. Wow. Some rather odd situations arose following the fire. Several weeks after, on the 12th of November, 1666, a body was found under the rubble of the fire-destroyed St. Paul's Cathedral. Surprisingly, the deceased was not a recent casualty, but rather from the medieval period. Robert Braybrook, who lived from 1381 to 1404, had been the Bishop of London and the Dean of Salisbury. Upon his death, he was buried in the old cathedral, and his corpse had mummified over the centuries, and the trauma of the Great Fire had destroyed his tomb. Now, many Stuart era folks came to Convocation House Yard, where he was placed, to have a look, including Samuel Pepys, who wrote of Braybrook, "A great man in his time, and Lord Chancellor, and his skeletons now exposed to be handled and derided by some, though admired for its duration by others, many flocking to see it." And there is some evidence to suggest that one of those who flocked to see the mummy was none other than Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine, as she was at the time.
Interesting.
And what she's accused of doing after that, people will have to read about. There are little ones listening, so I won't go into that. By the way, the drama of the event of the Great Fire of London was still a source of inspiration for artists well into the future. Here, for example, is Philippe Jacques de Lutterberg, his work from 1797, and it was called The Great Fire of London. So this is late 18th century, and you could see it still had the power to inspire.
Wonderful picture. Wonderful picture.
Yeah,
Even if it's 150 years later, 130 years later,
that's
it's lovely.
Okay. I think he still got it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Going back to the discovery of Braybrook's mummy, were there any such curiosities that were exposed after the fire, or was that mainly the big one?
I mean, he was propped up in Convocation Yard, but he was still there in 1675, I think. They just it managed one resurrection. They were standing waiting for the next, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a story. I can't remember whose coffin it was, but one coffin was unearthed when the crypt collapsed, and there were two Royal Society, we would call them scientists, they wouldn't have done, who were intrigued by this, and they drilled a hole in the coffin, and it was full of some kind of liquid. So one of them stuck his finger in the hole and licked it.
Oh,
I mean, isn't that just gross? Isn't that as gross as you can get? We've got horrible histories here, I think, Andrea. We've got.
Gosh.
Haven't we?
And now my eyes twitching because this is so gross. Okay. Anyway.
That's dedication to science. That is, I'll tell you.
Yes. Wow. Woo.
But
All right.
I mean, a lot of them were, a lot of them, because all these timbers and the stonework crashed down into the crypt where there were all these coffins. There were bones around. There were bits of old armor lying around. William Taswell remembered finding a sword, I think, and a helmet, and he's a schoolboy, putting them on and just playing. He found the corpse of an old lady who crept into the crypt for safety, and she's one of the very few that we documented fatalities. We don't think there were that many people died. Amazingly, I think there are 9 we know of, and I'm guessing maybe 50. The fire didn't move very fast; it moved inexorably, but people were able to get their possessions out, and very few were actually cut off by the flames. William Taswell's father, who lived in the east of the city, he's one of my favourites. He was a rich merchant, and he paid all these men. There were men in the street. He paid them all to take his belongings to safety from this big mansion where he lived. And they did take him to safety. He never saw them again. They just went.
Oh. Right.
People were looting. It's one thing that's rarely mentioned. People were looting all the way along in the warehouses and some of the houses along the Thames. There was a massive amount of looting and civil unrest going on. And again, we don't tend to think too much about that. But it was part of, people were taking. At one point, there was gridlock all the way around the city of London. And it wasn't because people were trying to escape London. It was because carters and wagoners from the surrounding counties were all pouring into the city because there was business to be done, and they were charging 4 times their normal rate to take people's goods out. And it was complete chaos, which is why Charles II and James Duke of York were going to great lengths to try and instill some kind of civil order. They were just worried that the whole thing was going to explode. They were also worried, incidentally, that people wouldn't come back. But one of the main worries after the fire was that people wouldn't come back to London. They'd gone to stay with relatives. They'd gone to Bristol or Oxford or the counties, the home counties. And the fear was if we weren't careful, nobody would bother come back. They'd settle. They'd set up businesses, and they wouldn't come. London would be derelict.
Right. Well, that's quite something. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I think it's time for us to talk about Sir Christopher Wren. And
always happy to talk about Christopher Wren, Andrea. Always happy. There's the man.
Yes,
that is the man.
He is. There he is. Yes. And here's a mezzotint of Wren by mezzotinter John Smith after Sir Godfrey Kneller. Now, you've written this amazing biography about Wren.
Thank you.
So you're definitely the right person to tell us about him, please, about who he was and how he came to be the one to put his stamp on the capital following the Great Fire.
Wowza, where do I start? I mean, Wren is, let me start in 1666, if you like, because in 1666, Wren is, at the time of the fire, he's 33 years old, nearly 34. He is an academic. He's a professor of astronomy, a Savilian professor of astronomy at Oxford University. And he's done a bit of dabbling in building, just a little bit. He's designed Pembroke College Chapel in Cambridge, and he's designed the Sheldonian, which is for graduation ceremonies in Oxford. Neither of those are finished. He's not unusual, gentlemen, as you know, Andrea. A gentleman dabbled in architecture. Amateurs did. John Evelyn did. Robert Hooke did. So he's not unusual there. He's much better known as a scientist. He is polymath. I mean, he's an astronomer. He made a map of the moon, a model of the moon, which Charles II has in his personal apartments at Whitehall. He tries to explain the problem of the rings of Saturn. He is probably the first person to perform a canine splenectomy in the world. Wow. And if you've ever, he's also, we think, the first person or one of the first people to make use of an intravenous injection in the lateral saphenous vein of a dog. In fact, what he's trying to do is he's trying to prove Harvey's theories about circulation of the blood. So he thinks
Right.
if you inject opium into the back leg of a dog and the dog gets stoned, then the assumption is that the opium's moving around its system. So he's famous throughout Europe, not for a builder. And as I think John Summerson, the great architectural historian, said, if Wren had died at the age of 34 without having finished a single building, he would still have been famous as a mathematician and an astronomer, as a medical man. He said at the end of his life he wished he hadn't dabbled in rubbish, which was his name for architecture. He wished he'd been a doctor, then he would have made some real money. Yeah, he wished he'd been a medical man, then he would have made some real money, is what he said.
Wow.
But he was getting more and more interested in the actual practice of architecture, and architecture as a mathematical science. Well, the how to. At that meeting in 27th of August, 1666, the meeting to discuss the future of St. Paul's, everybody said, look, we can prop this up. It's not the end of the world, except for Wren. Wren said, let's build a dome. I want to do a dome. Nobody had done a dome in England. He'd just been to France, where he'd seen domes in Paris. Nobody had done a dome in England. He said, go on, let me have a go. Let me do a dome. And they said, no, we'll patch the cathedral. And of course, 10 days later, the cathedral is a flaming ruin. And Wren gets to do the dome.
Yay! I quite like his dome. It's nice. I like it a lot.
Look, St. Paul's Cathedral. Let's not beat about the bush. St. Paul's Cathedral is the most beautiful building in the world. There is nothing to, I've been to St. Paul's dozens and dozens of times. I've never once stepped in that door when my heart hasn't, it's just the most spectacular thing. He's the first person, probably the first person in British history to have designed a building and seen it finished. If you think about, to design a cathedral and seen it finished.
Right. So that would be your favorite building then? Yeah. That was my next. Actually, that was my next question. No, okay.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's hold back. I mean, St. Paul's is the most beautiful building in the world. Sure. My favorite Wren church, because he superintended, as we know, he superintended the rebuilding of the city churches. And they rebuilt, we argue over the precise number, it's either 54, 55 or 56, but he superintended the rebuilding, and he personally designed, not all of them, but the big ones. And among those, St. Stephen's Walbrook, which does in fact have a dome of sorts, is the favourite. St. Stephen's Walbrook is a gem of a church. If your viewers haven't been to see St. Stephen's Walbrook, that's your afternoon sorted out. Get out there and go and do it. It's the most fantastic place.
Oh, thanks for the
St.
tip.
Paul's, yeah, do it. He's working at a time when you could know everything. You could know everything there was to know, and there's no question. I mean, Wren could be difficult, but he is a genius. I mean, from a child, everybody says, that genius of a youth. John Evelyn raves about his intelligence, and he could know everything there was to be known. It's after one of his lectures at Gresham College in London that the Royal Society is founded. He's a founder member of the Royal Society, becomes a president of the Royal Society. He can know everything and then know more. And that's incredible, I think. He's the most remarkable man. He lived a bit too long, perhaps. The habit of power, he becomes Surveyor General of the King's Works in 1669. So he gets, although he doesn't give up his day job as Professor of Astronomy for a few years, but he becomes Surveyor General of the King's Works, which is the top architectural job in the country. Now, he probably gets that. We don't know how he gets it. It's not for his architecture, because he hasn't really built much. He's comes from an Anglican family. His father was dean, who's also Christopher, was dean of Windsor Castle. His uncle Matthew was Bishop of Ely, was shoved into the Tower of London by Cromwell for 18 years. He's an arch royalist. So he's got, and he's friends with William Sancroft, who is the Dean of St. Paul's and who becomes Bishop of London, if I remember. Oh, does he become Archbishop of Canterbury? I should know that. I can't remember. Anyway, he's quite close with the Anglican hierarchy, if you like, and that gets him, I think, of rebuilding the city churches, which is an amazing program. It goes on for 50 years. Incredible thing.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that.
He's a wonderful man. He's my hero.
Definitely. That's great. And again, I really recommend this book. Okay, so
Thank you so much.
get
Thank you so much. A labour of love. Thank you very much
yes.
indeed.
Now, one of the things that was created after the Great Fire of London was the monument to the Great Fire of London, and it was erected close to the spot on Pudding Lane where it began. Now, here is this gorgeous etching. Would you please tell us a bit about this monument and its construction and history, please?
Well, Wren and Hooke decided they wanted a big telescope. And that was the plan, to turn this. I mean, you might realise that there were drawbacks to having a stone pillar, because you couldn't move it very easily. There was only so much of the sky it could see, and in fact, it didn't work because the vibrations of the traffic around about made it impossible to use as lenses to use in it. But it's the thing about the monument, which was Wren's work and Robert Hooke, his assistant. It was it was a joint effort by them. Originally, the authorities wanted to have a huge phoenix rising from the ashes on the top of the monument. And Wren it was who pointed out that if they had a phoenix, you imagine, just picture a phoenix rising from the ashes, its wings outspread, and it just gets blown off across the Thames, because when the wind hit it, it will be gone. So they agreed on a flaming urn, which is there at the moment. The interesting thing, I think, is that there was a plaque until the 1820s. There was a plaque. There's a wonderful carving by Caius Kibber of London in flames and the rescue attempt. But there was also a plaque there which said, it was put up a few years after the monument, which said, "Here by permission of heaven, hell broke loose on this Protestant city through the barbarous malice of papists." It was for 150 years, the great lie. For 150 years, it was said that Catholics burned down London, and it was a great lie.
Wow. Well, it's good that was removed then.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. It's I think it's in the Museum of London, the plaque. I think it's still there.
Right.
They stuck, yeah, it can be seen.
Yeah. All right. Next, we have a tankard made of silver and crafted circa 1675-76, roughly a decade after the Great Fire. This item is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the scenes engraved on these tankards depict the traumatic events of the Fire of London and the Great Plague. If we have a close-up on one of the sides, and this is the one for the plague.
I love it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And at the bottom, you could see EBG 1665. Now, the tankards were commissioned as gifts to the friends of Sir Edmund Bury Godfrey. Yes, that's the same Godfrey who was murdered, thus becoming the impetus for the popish plot concocted by Titus Oates and Israel Tongue. So that's a whole other kettle of fish, but it's interesting to to see that there is something from him there.
Can we just lay one ghost to rest?
Yes,
the fire did not halt the plague.
That is a very popular question.
Stop the plague. Yeah, the plague had died out basically by late 1665.
Yes,
there were sort of sporadic outbreaks, but the fire had nothing to do with it at all.
Right. Good.
Now,
are there any other myths?
My hectoring tone. Just notice
Thank
that.
you. It's good to know. We'd like to bust the myths. You know, if there are any other myths about this that you'd like to bust for our audience, please feel free to do that.
I mean, the other one, of course, we mentioned in passing. You said a Frenchman met a horrible end. Robert Hubert. Robert Hubert, after the fire, came forward and said he started it. It was French. I think it was a Huguenot. They're not quite sure. And he was actually apprehended in Essex, as they closed the ports after the fire because it was thought that terrorists would try and escape. Again, there's still this myth that it was an act of war. And he was caught in Essex and taken back to London. He said, "Yeah, it was me. I started it."
Right.
And they said, "Well, sure, prove it. And he said, well, he took them to the site of Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane, which was just a smouldering, it was flat. And he said, I threw a firebomb in there, that window. Now, Robert Hubert wasn't actually in England when the fire broke out. He was still in France, as I found out later, and everybody knew. It's an instance of false confession syndrome. Everybody knew he was lying. He was just making it all up. But he stuck to his story, so they hanged him at Tyburn. Poor chap. I mean, he was hanged for starting the fire of London, and
Incredible.
he didn't. He just didn't.
Wow. Thank you for that. Going back to the questions from the audience, was anyone held accountable in a legal sense? Like did Bloodworth have?
No, I mean,
anything?
Robert Hubert was, of course, held responsible in a legal sense.
So he was, and
he was,
okay, but none of the officials or anything were.
No. I mean, Bloodworth's term of office ended that October. It ended a month later.
Okay.
And he asked the king if he could get a kind of glowing testimonial, and the king said no.
Okay.
Not surprisingly.
All right. And the last one was any government aid forthcoming in rebuilding for folks?
This is one of the most intriguing, and I'd keep it simple because it's a very complicated question, very complicated answer. But the straightforward answer is no.
Okay.
The straightforward answer is that in 3 years, London. Now, look, you imagine if you, most Londoners they live over the shop. They live like Thomas Farriner. They live over their business. Most Londoners are tenants, right? They don't own their property. So with a fire, you lose your home, you lose your business, and according to the tenancy agreement, you are liable for any damage done to the property. There's no insurance. So you've lost your business, you've lost your house, and you've got to put it all back together. You've got no money. What's amazing to me is that in 3 years, most Londoners did that. Most Londoners just rebuilt their homes and got on with their lives. Some of the big buildings, there was a coal tax. There's a tax on coal brought into London, and that coal tax went first to restore some of the big important civic buildings like the Royal Exchange and Bridewell Prison. And then some of it was diverted towards the building of St. Paul's and the city churches. So there is some government aid, but very, very little. People just got on and did it. It's astonishing.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And I hope that answered your question. And I'll have one last thing before we say goodbye. It's what I ask everyone. Fantasy dinner party in the Stuart period. Who would you invite? What would you serve? And who would you have sitting next to you?
Well, it's Christopher Wren and Christopher Wren. That's the first and third question. It would be interesting to me to have some of the Royal Society guys there, to have Robert Hooke, who was a strange and difficult man, but it'd be interesting to see Hooke and Wren and possibly Dean Sancroft, the Dean of St. Paul's, who's an interesting figure. What to eat? I don't know. They used to like pies. They ate a lot of pies. So maybe we should we should have a pie, I think, shouldn't we? And I'd have to have Wren sitting next to me. There are a couple of times in Wren's career where I would love to have been a fly on the wall. Just very quickly. One is when, in fact, let me just give you one. And that is when St. Paul's was almost finished, Wren fell out. He was an old man. He fell out with the authorities and he just walked off. He walked out with it almost finished, but not quite. So the church authorities sent somebody round to Wren's house to ask his advice on finishing the parapet. It was a trivial thing. The person they sent round was Isaac Newton. You imagine Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren sitting there discussing the finishing of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the greatest buildings in the world. God, what I would have given to be there.
That would have been amazing.
Wouldn't it just?
Yes. Wow. Though Newton doesn't have a great reputation of being a very affable person, perhaps. Maybe.
Nor was Christopher Wren sometimes, actually. He could be quite sharp. He could be
All
quite
right.
sharp.
Right. Anyway, it sounds like a nice fantasy dinner party.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
with lots of pies and wine
Yeah,
or
yeah,
ale.
lots of wine. Yes,
Yes.
definitely wine.
Wonderful. I love that. That's great. Thank you so much. Um, all right then. Well, that's all for us for now. So many thanks, Adrian, for chatting with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you
It's
so
been a
much.
joy and a delight. Thank you so much, Andrea. I've really enjoyed
Thank you.
myself. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That's great. Bye. Mhm. Well, if you were intrigued by any of Professor Tinniswood's books, you'll find them at any good bookseller. Here we have the cover of his latest book, The Power and the Glory, The Country House Before the Great War, which will be out in October. I hope you enjoyed this month's show, which was, as always, produced by Gavin Orland of Orland Media. That's all for this episode. Until next time, when our guest will be Margaret Evans Porter, don't forget to keep it Stuart. Goodbye.